It's time to bring out the BetterWorldian in all of us. Welcome to BetterWorldians Radio with your hosts, Ray, Mary Sue, and Gregory Hansel. BetterWorldians Radio inspires you with the people and ideas that are making the world a better place. You'll hear how small acts can make a big difference every day. Now, here are Ray, Mary Sue, and Gregory.
Hi, welcome to BetterWorldians Radio. BetterWorldians Radio is a weekly broadcast whose mission is to uplift and inspire you to make the world a better place. I'm Ray Hansel, joined today by my co-host, Gregory Hansel. BetterWorldians Radio is brought to you by BetterWorldians Foundation, a 501c3 nonprofit whose mission is to make the world a better place by encouraging the very best in everyone. Joining us today on BetterWorldians Radio is Dr. Jay Richards to discuss how capitalism and entrepreneurship can make the world a better place. Jay is an expert in political philosophy and theology. He's also an author of many books, including the New York Times bestseller, Infiltrated and Indivisible. Dr. Richards is also a research assistant professor in the Busch School of Business and Economics at the Catholic University of America, a senior fellow at the Discovery Institute, and executive editor of The Stream.
Hi, Jay. This is Greg. Thanks for joining us today on BetterWorldians Radio.
It's great to be with you.
Thank you. So, Jay, as you know, capitalism is an economic system that has created more wealth than ever seen before in human history. It's lifted more communities out of poverty than any previous system, has spurred the interconnection of the world through advanced technologies, and has helped people flourish by providing reliable livelihoods, among many, many other successes. As we've covered often on BetterWorldians Radio, capitalism is truly a force for good, and yet it's often under attack these days from people across countries and across the political spectrum. So I'm hoping we could chat today about where we are with capitalism these days, help dispel some of the myths that plague it, and let's chat about how it might possibly be tweaked or improved.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Great. So to begin, let me just ask you straight out, why do you believe capitalism is a system that has and will continue to make a difference for the good in people's lives?
I think that capitalism, or whatever you want to call it, this system of rule of law, private property, limited government, and economic freedom is simply the best known alternative for lifting entire cultures out of poverty. I mean, if you want a system that actually enables large numbers of people to emerge from what the UN calls absolute poverty, there's actually only one way up the pathway to that mountain. It's not like we have several different alternatives that work equally well. It's this system that unfortunately we call capitalism. The word actually came from the socialist and Karl Marx. It was a pejorative term that they used to essentially to attack what they were seeing in the early stages of industrialization in Europe. We're sort of stuck with the word, and so very often when I'm talking about this, I say, okay, tell me what's in your mind when you hear the word capitalism. And people, if they haven't studied it, usually it's that tuxedo-clad guy from the Monopoly game. You know, his name is actually Uncle Pennybags, and it's a caricature of the late J.P. Morgan. And if you're picturing him or you're picturing the greedy Mr. Potter from It's a Wonderful Life, then I can understand why you might think capitalism is a bad idea. But if you simply mean what the dictionary definition means, private property, limited government, rule of law, economic freedom, there's just simply no better alternative for doing the things that you'd want an economy to do. Not just for the poor, but for everyone else to be able to channel our legitimate interests and our innovation into socially beneficial outcomes. It's really the only game in town for doing that. And if you doubt that, just look at the Index of Economic Freedom on the Internet. 2017, almost every year, the index still treats Hong Kong as a separate country. It's almost always right at the top. And North Korea is always at the bottom. That tells you pretty much everything you need to know about the role of economic freedom and economic flourishing.
Well, let me ask you, other than the top hat and the thimble, what are some common misconceptions regarding capitalism that you hear today?
Oh, man, there's so many. I mean, I wrote this book a few years ago called Money, Greed, and God to talk about really the top 8 myths about both, not just capitalism, but wealth and poverty in general. Probably the first one's the one we've mentioned already, this idea that it's all about greed and acquiring wealth. Well, that's what miserliness is. And so if you think of the medieval miser, he was the guy that hoarded his wealth, hid his gold in his mattress or in a safe somewhere. Free enterprise, capitalism, entrepreneurship are nothing like that. If you think about what the entrepreneur does in a market economy, he puts his is wealth at risk in
Yes.
pursuit of a vision that might or might not pay off. So it's literally the opposite of the protective pose of the miser. I call that the greed myth. It's not a myth that some people are greedy. Of course they are. The question is the essence of enterprise and capitalism greed, or is it something else? Another one that's very, very popular, including among many religious believers, is this idea of a zero-sum game when it comes to trade. A zero-sum game is just a game where if somebody is going to win, somebody has to lose. And so we'll often think that, well, if we're trading with other countries and they're doing well, that must be harming us. But of course, economists all know that this isn't true. The countries that we trade with Japan and South Korea, we all end up, over the long run, better off as a result of doing this. And so it's just a myth to think that trade is going to lead to always to winners and losers. And there's several others like that, but those are kind of the prevalent ones, that it's all about greed, and that somehow if the sort of field of trade expands, that somehow it's going to harm a lot of people.
So much good stuff there. I think I love that you highlighted entrepreneurial risk. I don't want to take away from the next segment when you'll get into that with Ray, but there's never this appreciation of the weight of that risk and the difficulty of that risk. There is this leap and then that will appear aspect of entrepreneurism that is quite a weight. That's quite a the words to describe it are escape me at the moment because it's such a massive undertaking, and it is difficult to do that every day, and that's why entrepreneurs really are, in some ways, the heroes of this economy.
Yeah. I mean, and actually, this is the irony of that, is that if you think about what novelists actually make the entrepreneur a hero. Lots of people should realize that. Look, if you take risk on behalf of a vision that creates value for other people, that's a heroic act. And yet it's left to the atheist Ayn Rand, who embraced selfishness, to make the entrepreneur the hero. It's just truly depressing. I think this is why people still read Ayn Rand. It's not because she was a great novelist. It's because she at least had that insight to make the entrepreneur a hero, and there need to be more people doing that.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right, and I don't want to get too heady on the show right now for folks at home, but I think it's unfortunate that we only have her because there's so many different aspects and facets of what it is to be that entrepreneurial hero that she doesn't cover. A point that you mentioned in your book that I'd like to get into if we can on the fly here is you make the point that wealth is something that's created. And that's not something I think that's appreciated. It's not out there kind of in the universe for us to kind of move around. It has to be produced. It has to be forged. Could you speak to that?
Absolutely. In fact, this is another myth that I call this the materialist myth. The materialist myth is just the idea that wealth is just about stuff. It's a pot of gold or, some fixed amount of property, and it's out there. And so if somebody gets too much, they get more than their fair share, and that leaves less for everyone else. This is probably the most insidious myth because in reality, economists know this. Sure, economies go up and down, but over time, the total amount of wealth in free economies goes up. It goes up for everyone. The late Steve Jobs did not get rich stealing iPods and iPhones from homeless people. It seems obvious, but of course, he participated in a process of value creation for himself and millions of other people. And, in some ways, for me, this isn't just economically interesting. It's philosophically interesting because it suggests that whatever human beings are, we are creatures that aren't just kind of material beings like apes in the trees. We actually have this capacity to take the things of the material world, to take sand and transform it into fiber optic cables and computer chips. That's not just economically interesting, that's philosophically interesting.
Yeah, indeed. It's interesting that you mentioned Jobs. I'm an Apple fan for sure. We're recording this on an Apple computer. Jobs famously said that the design is not just how it looks, it's how it works. And then recently Tim Cook kind of added to that, saying products are one of the most important ways that companies can make a difference in the world because the way that we use our products, to an extent those products use us. And that's not always a bad thing. They can actually impact the way we move through the world. We see that in the information revolution, for example.
We do. I mean, we often think people that, are not down in the weeds in an economy imagine that what entrepreneurs do is they look out there and say, okay, here's a market, and I'm going to try to get into that market. And people often do that. But sometimes entrepreneurs actually create markets that weren't there before. I mean, it's not like we were all sitting around in 1995 thinking, gosh, I'd love to have a smartphone with apps on it, and a map. I mean, you hadn't even thought of that, and yet this technology suddenly arrives in 2007. For a lot of us, it's just sort of a luxury, but I know for me, it's actually an essential part of my job, of what I do every day. And so it goes from being non-existent to a market being created that then opens up new possibilities for us that weren't there before.
Well, on the tail of that, then let me ask you, what are some of the other underappreciated aspects of capitalism that help it create so much wealth and opportunity and that we just don't hear from folks?
I mean, I think more than anything, it's the fact that it is kind of what I'll call a mind-centric system. A friend of mine, the late social philosopher Michael Novak, always talked about that. When he talked about capitalism, he would always point back to the fact that the word capital comes from the word caput, which is actually the Latin word for head, when this actually goes back to the fact that people used to count their wealth by counting heads of cattle. But he said it's interesting that head would be in there because, of course, it's from our heads, it's from our minds, it's from the production of ideas that new wealth is actually created, either creating things that weren't there by sort of reconfiguring matter or writing software, which is entirely bits rather than atoms. And I think what's underappreciated about capitalism is precisely that it's the best system for allowing us to channel our creativity and our innovation in ways that benefit ourselves and benefit others. If you look at other systems, a feudalist system or the kind of corrupt cronyism in Latin America or socialism, they just don't do that. Socialist countries, great innovations in technology never come from socialist companies or countries. At best, they just sort of ape or mimic things that are actually developed in more vibrant capitalist countries.
Yeah, I really love that focus on mind. I didn't know that etymology makes me, among other things, think about the importance of intellectual property. Just because, just like risk, good ideas need to be incentivized and appreciated and honored as a way to fuel the power of this system.
They really do. And I mean, this is another thing that Michael Novak was so good at, is talking about just the genius of a patent system and intellectual property protections, which is it's an unusual thing. It's counterintuitive to people who are used to thinking about property as, well, cattle or land or houses or gold. This idea that, no, actually an idea could be property too. And as you said, we want a society in which people have an incentive to develop new ideas. And so I'm always having friends say, well, isn't it terrible that this drug company is charging all this money for this drug? And I said, well, look, you only have a few choices in the world. So you could have a country in which the government dictates ahead of time the price of a drug, and you're never going to have another drug invented. Or you can have a system in which companies have the incentive to risk hundreds of millions of dollars and years of testing and government approval, and with the knowledge that they're going to be able to make that back 10 years down the line. And if you have a country like that, you'll have new drugs that are expensive. You'll also get a whole lot of new drugs that wouldn't exist otherwise.
Right,
so take your pick.
Yeah. I've seen that in a background in software design. Just the amount of testing and innovation, trial and error that goes into that, and sometimes, especially in a freemium economy, which people are most used to these days, where it's like, because it's something they don't pay for, they ironically expect it to be perfect. And you say, hey, listen, this is, it may be played for free, but it wasn't free to create, and it certainly wasn't free of a lot of headaches and nightmares, so you have to appreciate that. You mentioned a couple other systems that, of course, don't nearly measure up, but I did want to ask you, in your expert opinion, are there any critiques of capitalism that we should be talking about? Are there any excesses or issues that should be addressed or foundational principles that should be improved?
I would say, on the one hand, there are bad things that happen in capitalist economies, but they're not unique to capitalism. So it's not like pornography or prostitution or robbery are unique to capitalism. So people we're fallen, we're sinful, we do bad stuff, and so there are lots of things you see in a capitalist economy, but they shouldn't be blamed uniquely on capitalism. I do think probably the primary cost of a vibrant capitalist economy is disruption. I mean, that's just simply the reality, is that if you've got a lot of innovation, if you've got somebody that develops DVDs and CDs, they are going to displace things like 8-track tape players. I mean, my dad had a massive investment in the 70s in 8-track tapes. Unfortunately, they were at best transition technology. They were terrible. They got displaced by cassettes and then by CDs and DVDs, which are now being displaced simply by streaming technologies. And so it's easy to think, well, gosh, it's terrible that at one point there were factories making 8-track tape players and 8-track tapes somewhere that got displaced. Those were jobs disappeared. But the alternative would be, okay, well, what are we going to do when nobody wants 8-track tapes anymore? Are we going to have a government subsidy and they just keep making them and then dump them in a landfill or something like that?
That's
I would say disruption is a real cost. What that means is that technologies, industries, sometimes even entire towns, if they're built around a single technology, become obsolete, and so we have to transition into doing something else. That's a real cost. Now, I think we misunderstand the full cost if we think it leads to permanent unemployment, but I don't think we should make light of the fact that if you're used to doing something for 20 years and suddenly your product, nobody wants it anymore, that's going to be disruptive to you and to your family and to your community.
That's interesting. I think myself of Betamax and VHS, which will date me.
Yes.
But we were lucky enough to kind of wait and start with VHS. But we knew a handful of people that had drawers full of Betamax tapes and or laser discs or something like that.
No, Laserdisc. In fact, my best friend, his family are early adopters of Laserdisc, and I can still remember these big discs. And they ended up with 3 movies, and then the thing just completely disappeared.
Yeah, and they were pretty cool. But they looked very nice, but obviously the media was ridiculous, hard to unwieldy, I should say. The other thing I wanted to jump on about that, though, more seriously, is just this sense, and again, without wanting to go too deep down the rabbit hole here, though, that disruption, to a certain extent, is a force of nature, right? It's something that is itself not even unique to capitalism. It's something that we deal with, and it's a creative force in the nature of things. And again, I have, like you, a philosophy background. I don't want to get people at home too blown away here, but I do think it's important to think about that. Disruption can be a creative force and often is an essential creative force.
It is, absolutely. I mean, of course, the great economist Joseph Schumpeter coined this term creative destruction. That's what he meant, is that whenever you're building something, especially in the physical world, if it's better than what was being used before and it substitutes for what's being used, it's by definition going to end up displacing that thing. Mm-hmm. That's different than a system in which, say, the feudalist system, where people had trades and guilds and people passed down their trade from father to son to grandson. All these English words like baker and smith and cobbler, dozens of names. These are all trade names. We're not going to have, the webmaster is never going to be a surname because things just simply move too quickly. But that tells you, okay, there's a cost there. If we were in a more stable period, you probably know, based on what your dad is doing, you probably have a sense of what you're going to do. The bad news is we'd all be much, much poorer, and we'd have many, many fewer opportunities and fewer options for exercising our creative freedom than we do now.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. It's even, my kids, we have a flat screen TV in the living room, and my kids who are young will touch the television screen thinking that they can interface with it, which of course is a disaster. We're like, please stop touching it. But it gives a sense of how they already see what the world ahead is going to be like, and who knows where we're headed next. There's so much we could say on that, but actually I want to take this opportunity again in talking about disruption and what comes along with that with a lot of people is fear. And there's a good deal of fear these days regarding trends like globalization and automation. And as you know, we were speaking about this prior to the recording, that historically these forces have greatly increased wealth and created a multitude of jobs, even spawning entire industries. But you get the sense from all over the world, and again across the political spectrum these days, that things have gone too far and we have to pull back and we have to cocoon. What are your views of these fears? And do you think we need to pull back, or should we double down and move forward?
I really don't think we have a real choice. I mean, just to take automation, for instance. I mean, first of all, we've been doing this for centuries. We have been using more complex machinery so that we get more output from every unit of input. In other words, so we don't have to put a whole lot of labor into something and we get a whole lot more on the other side. This happened in industrialization just since the American founding. Less than 5% of people at the time of the American founding were outside the farm economy. In other words, about 95% of the population was working on farms when the Declaration of Independence was signed. In 1900, still half the country were living and working on farms. Now it's actually less than 1%. So how is that possible? It's possible because we have gotten so much more productive at farming, at agriculture, so that fewer and fewer people can make more than enough, not only for ourselves and for everyone else. So what did that do? Well, one thing it did is it caused a lot of people that were doing farming not to need to do farming anymore, and so there were disruptions and hard transitions. This happened to my grandfather in the panhandle of Texas. He was kind of connected to farming, but never really had a farm because all the good land was taken. So he ended up actually using a cutting-edge technology called the truck and baled hay, actually, for most of his life. The same thing is happening now. Things that we're used to doing, especially, I would say, assembly line work in which people are essentially doing the job of machines, the same thing over and over. Every one of those jobs is probably going to disappear. That type of manual labor is going to disappear. The type of mental work that's really just kind of simple calculation, so work that people do in accounting that's really repetitive, or in banking that's really repetitive, that's going to get replaced by machines. Those jobs will go away. The myth, though, is the idea that those jobs go away and none come along to replace it. I mean, saying now that, well, all these jobs are going to disappear and lead to massive unemployment. If that were true, human history would be one long, sad story of increasing unemployment. But that's not at all what it looks like. If you look at the United States, there are 10 times more people now than there were 150 years ago. There are also 10 times as many jobs, and most of those jobs are much more lucrative than they were earlier. This is one of these places where people have got to remember human beings are creative creatures. We're not just consumers of wealth and land and air and food. We are creators of value. And when one type of work that we do is displaced, there's going to be other different, really unanticipatable ways that we create value in that new situation.
We'll talk more with Jay Richards in a moment, but right now I'd like to take a brief break and tell our listeners a bit about our sponsor, a social enterprise called A Better World. A Better World is an uplifting virtual world game on Facebook that encourages social good, positive mindsets, and giving to social causes to make a positive difference in the world. Players in the game actually do things like sharing acts of kindness, expressing gratitude, sending get-well notes to real-world sick children, and much more. In effect, we use in our virtual world game, we use kindness as a currency to advance. So far, 4 million players have participated in this virtual world game and have performed over 40 million acts of kindness or good deeds in over 100 countries. Every month, in addition, A Better World partners with a specific charity, 501c3, and challenges our game players to do a certain number of good deeds within the game itself. When they do, A Better World releases funds to that monthly charity. This summer, we challenged our players to complete 75,000 good deeds in-game, and when they did, we released funds to provide a month of meals for 40 orphan children at the Miracle Foundation in India. Great job, BetterWorldians. Keep at it. You can find out more at betterworld.com. And now let's welcome back Jay Richards. What a wonderful conversation we've had in this first part of this. I enjoyed it very much.
It's great to be with you guys.
Great to have you on board. Let me begin. People talk a great deal about the importance of small business. I want to talk a little bit about that. How essential do you think the role of the entrepreneur is in this capitalistic world that we live in?
Well, this is how important it is. Most new jobs that are created in very small businesses that start off with 2 or 3 or 4 people. So if you want new jobs to get created when old ones get disrupted and displaced, you've got to have a lot of people engaging in small business and in starting new jobs. That's the good news. The bad news is that most jobs that are destroyed are also small businesses, and that's because small businesses are high risk. They're not stable. Right. So what that means is that if you want good, sustainable employment and jobs in an economy, you want lots and lots of little small businesses to be able to be created, and then you want an environment where some of them can go on to become medium and very large businesses. And I would compare it to something like sea turtles. I mean, most people have seen these documentaries where female sea turtles, when we're about to lay their eggs, they go up on a beach and lay a whole lot of eggs and then disappear, and then eventually the eggs hatch and these little hatchlings, most of them actually get eaten. They either drown in the surf or they get eaten before they actually get to the water. The only reason there are any sea turtles is because some of them make it to the water, actually get to food, and they grow and become big sea turtles themselves. That's sort of how the churn of business and enterprise is. You need lots of businesses to be able to be started, and then you need a condition in which some of those can go on to become bigger businesses, because it's not lots of tiny little businesses don't keep long-term jobs. That's, think of that as the sort of startup where they come from at the beginning.
Mm-hmm. Now, despite the new tech and other trends making it easier than ever to create these new businesses, there's been a surprising decline, from what I understand, in entrepreneurship. Why do you think that is?
I think it's a couple of things. First of all, I'd say there's a policy problem in that government policy tends to discourage people to get into new business. I mean, it's always politically popular to talk about new business, but the reality is that politicians are often tempted to implement various regulations that just make it a heck of a lot harder to do that. So there's a policy side to this. But I really think that the main cause is a cultural difference. It turns out a study recently that I had just found said that right now it's fewer people move than at any time in the last 50 years. That's a strange thing, because if you think about the founding of the American economy, it came from people coming overseas and starting family farms. We're at a moment where Native Americans simply don't do that. And you can contrast this with recent immigrants. If you think about recent immigrants from, say, Latin America or Mexico, if they go someplace and jobs disappear, they get up and move to where the jobs are. Native-born Americans, though, are much less inclined to actually do that. They tend to sort of stay put, strangely enough. And so a lot of that, that just comes down to a willingness to exercise courage and exercise risk that government policy can't do much about.
Yeah, that's interesting to hear that perspective. We're serial entrepreneurs, so we've had successful businesses in the past, and when we left some of these businesses, instead of retiring, we were crazy enough to do it all over again. So once you've bitten in and seen the benefits that sort of derive from this, it's hard to sort of really seriously not jump back in again, because the excitement and the benefits far outweigh the risk. But I think if you've never done it before, then cutting through for the first time, as you're describing here, is a lot harder to do that, because the more you get those golden handcuffs wrapped around your wrist, the less likely you are to say, well, I've got to give this up now, or I might have to give that up. And you really haven't experienced sort of the flip side of that that's so exciting and so vibrant.
That's right. And I think that the other thing to note is that we as creatures tend to like comfort. And so many of the sort of earlier generations of Americans, what would lead them to leave their family and native homes and to get on a ship to someplace they'd never been? Well, in many cases, what it was is absolute desperation. A lot of the Irish that came to the United States are here simply because they're likely to starve in Ireland. It was that bad. And when you're absolutely desperate, that kind of focuses the attention and courage. Most people now, the reality is, even if you're not doing really well, there's no chance that you're going to starve to death. And so there's in some ways less incentive to act risky and act courageously.
Yeah, I think impending death definitely does get your attention. Unbelievably so. So what do you think about the new social enterprise, social capital, or double bottom line type companies that are explicitly tying together social good with business success?
Well, I think I always want to know the real details, because, of course, any company that's really creating value is involved in a social enterprise. But it doesn't mean that the only way to create value is, in the for-profit world. There are ways to create value also in the non-profit world. But whenever somebody tells me I'm working on a social enterprise opportunity in which I'm creating value for people, even if I'm in the for-profit world, I want to know, okay, what are you doing? What is that? Because that's probably a really good business idea. Are you talking about making sure employees are treated really well, or making sure people connect in the community? Honestly, those things sound like really good business plans to me. It's not a long-term business plan to treat your employees or to treat your potential customers poorly.
Yeah, I know. We had a business that for years was focusing on a for-profit, but we always had sort of this feeling towards our employees, towards our customers, towards our vendors that we extended into our business practices and tied it in specifically to quality measurements that we could actually look at and see how they were improving. But when we started this business, we started it with a focus that said, hey, we can make money and we can make a difference, and let's do that more deliberately. So it's a different sort of, but they're not as many. I think that the thing that drives that sea turtle to the water is getting to the water, and that means how do I get that cash to survive, et cetera. So
that's right. I mean, the reality is that what profit is it's an indication that you're serving your customer. If the only thing you're thinking about is making a buck, you're not likely to actually do something that serves other people. But you need, in the for-profit world, what that does, the opposite of profit is loss. And so what the profit does is it tells you, okay, I'm creating value for someone.
That's true. So how can we encourage entrepreneurship? What do you think the best ways to foster an environment hospitable to the sort of the creative risk and perseverance and perhaps even the self-belief that's necessary to launch new enterprises?
Honestly, I think what you're doing right now, actually, because I think this is in many ways a cultural thing. I mean, if entrepreneurs, we know that entrepreneurship is actually a contagious activity. And so the more closely tied you are, either by family ties or simply in a city, and you're around people that are starting businesses and taking risks, you're more likely to do that. If you're isolated from people that are doing that, you're less likely to do it. And so it's a sticky, contagious activity, which means it's essentially a cultural thing. So we need to be raising our children to think this way, to think about, okay, what kind of businesses could you start? What kind of risks could you take? The sort of opposite temptation is just simply to protect ourselves. This is what honestly distresses me a lot about what's happening in many colleges. We need to be teaching our children to be adaptable, to be able to take risk, to be able to fail, and to be able to learn from failure and move on. We don't want our children to be hyper-fragile, where they can't take the bumps and the bruises that the world offers them. And so I think, honestly, in more than a political thing, it's going to take a cultural change and an emphasis on the virtues of entrepreneurship and on entrepreneurship as a genuine calling, as a genuine vocation.
Yeah, one of the things that was going through my mind as we were talking over the last few minutes was, I guess about, I don't want to say how many decades ago it was, but I had finally arrived at the perfect job, and I had an opportunity, and I had a bit of a problem with basically advancing a specific initiative for a while, and then suddenly all those problems sort of fell out. But in the midst of it, I decided to start a business, and speaking to this guy who I was speaking to at the time, he said, "Well, we've eliminated all these problems, we've shifted some things around." And as he knew I was leaving, he said, "What do you want?" And there was a little tiny out-of-body experience that sort of was looking down at this saying, "Oh my gosh, I can ask for anything I want right now." And I knew I was about to get this tremendous initiative, the training initiative that we were doing that was going to be very successful, and it was. And I knew that this is the time to ask for the raise. This is the time to ask for the perk. This is the time to ask for additional responsibility. And you know what came out of my mouth at that time? Call me crazy, but I said, I want my freedom.
Wow.
And I that to me was that's when I crossed that bridge. That's when I crossed. And he said, "Okay, we'll work it out. We hate to see you go, and we'll actually give you a consulting contract in the meantime, et cetera." So from that point forward, I never looked back, even though I was given opportunities. But I guess once I said I'm going to go in that direction, why look back? But it was a telling moment, really, that I always think back on, and it came to mind as we were speaking. So looking forward into the future, how do you hope that capitalism and perhaps particularly entrepreneurship will continue to help to make the world a better place?
I think it simply has to. I mean, despite the fact that people are worried about automation or about stagnant wages, there's never been a better time to be alive for creating value for other people. I mean, think about how limited the options were for our ancestors 200 years ago. My great-great-great-grandfather had basically one option, which was farming. Right now, if you can read, if you can surf the internet, which describes about anyone, you can actually learn a graduate degree level of information practically for free just online. You can, with Udacity, for a few $1,000s, actually get coding training and get your money back if you don't get a job. This is just an unbelievable time to be alive, because in many ways the information economy is much more fitted to the human mind and human creativity than other kinds of economies. So yes, let's prepare for the disruption, but also look at the amazing opportunities for entrepreneurship and for value creation for our future.
Hear, hear. Very, very well said. Jay, thanks an awful lot. Thank you very much for joining us today at BetterWorldians Radio. You're right in the forefront of exactly what we're proposing to people and proponents of, and we really appreciate the time that you took to join with us.
Great to be with you.
You're very welcome. BetterWorldians Radio is brought to you by BetterWorldians Foundation, a 501c3 nonprofit whose mission is to make the world a better place by encouraging the best in everyone. We believe it's essential to plant flowers and not just pull weeds. We focus on positive thinking, positive values, and positive actions. In short, our vision is to bring out the BetterWorldian in everyone so that we can all make it a better world. So go to BetterWorldians.com, become part of the mission, and support our endeavor with your charitable works. And until next time, everyone, please be a better worldian.